960 AD. Think about that. When you stop and you think about going to New York and Philadelphia and Boston and Washington, D.C., and we ooh and ah over things that are 200 years old, this stuff is 1,200 years old. And that's what's really pretty awesome and amazing is how ancient these things are. The current Gothic-style church that we have today was begun in 1245 by Henry III to replace the old church from 1065. This church was consecrated in 1269. It is known as the Westminster to distinguish it from the Eastminster, which is St. Paul's Cathedral in London. The monastery first dissolved in 1540 under King Henry VIII, but experienced on-again, off-again monasticism over time. Of course, there are no monks. That is not monastic today, and so instead it is more like a parish church instead of a monastery, but still goes by the name of Westminster. So these are just some pictures from outside Westminster Abbey. We saw the choir school where the choir boys go. And what did they say, Allison, about the choir boys? They said that the age of maturity for young boys is getting lower and lower. And so their voices, once their voices change, they can't sing in the boys' choir anymore, but they can finish out the school term. So the boys actually start practicing, rehearsing, studying the music and doing the liturgies and things like that. But they also know that there's a time limit on how long they can stay within the choral group. This little cross that you see right here, you're going to see it throughout a lot of the pictures. You can even see it in a larger form here. I pointed out to you because this is the kind of cross that we have here at Emmanuel. You'll see it in the windows, you'll see it in some of the woodwork and things like that. And the fact that it kept showing itself up over and over again made me feel like our church is, through that symbol, connected to our Anglican heritage. And so I'll just be pointing that out, or if you see it and I don't point it out, notice it, point it out for me. Because evensong was taking place at the time that we were there, we were not allowed to take pictures inside, so I hijacked this from the internet. This gives you a sense of the vertical height of the space. This is the choir stall where the choir boys sing. We got in line early enough that we were allowed, as pilgrims, to sit in the choir stall. The altar is back here, and so where we sat was right on the end, on the far end from where the camera is. It was exquisite, it was gorgeous, and you know what? I wanted to bring my journal in here and read to you something that I had written. The vertical height is meant to draw us upward in body and soul and to recognize the enormity of God and also acknowledge God's closeness. What I felt and experienced in this was not that was a ceiling, but it was almost like I was looking at the underside of the floor of heaven. I mean, that's what it really felt like. And then when those young boys started singing, it was just amazing. It was awesome. So, germs on the bus go round and round, round and round, round and round. So this is why I had the flu, because we were so closely compacted together. So after London and after the evensong that we experienced at Westminster Abbey, we jumped on that bus and we went. London is right here, and we stopped at a Catholic retreat center about here. Then we went on to Rochester and had lunch, and then we went on to Canterbury. I want to point out where Canterbury is in relation to London, and I also want to show you where Canterbury is in relation to France. That's very important with the development of Christianity that moves through France and then eventually jumps and makes it to the Isle of Britain. So this is the Catholic rest stop. It had been dissolved as a Catholic monastery years ago. We'll talk a little bit about the history in just a moment. It was a privately held retreat center, and now it is again in the hands of the Roman Catholic Church, and it has, over its history, welcomed pilgrims on the way to Canterbury from London, and it still welcomes pilgrims on the way from Canterbury to London. There's a plaque there that says 1251, which is when it was dissolved, through 1951. You know what? That's not right. I'm not sure what the 1251 represents because that's not the right date for when it was dissolved. But it does translate in Latin, from the Latin, the Carmelite flower vigorously arises. In 1951, it was reestablished as a Roman Catholic monastery and retreat center. They have places where pilgrims can stay. They have a chapel with the relics of St. Simon Stock, who was a Carmelite monk who saw Mary in 1251 in Cambridge, England. He was entrusted with what's called with a scapular. You know what a scapular is? That's those brown cloths that people wear. It's got one on the front and one on the back, and some monks wear big ones on the front and the back. A lot of Roman Catholics wear small ones, and the promise from Mary is that the person who dies wearing a scapular is rewarded with the kingdom of heaven without making a pit stop in purgatory. Take that for what it is, and I am neither denying nor endorsing. So that's the Catholic rest stop on the way to Cambridge. I wanted to show you Canterbury. Excuse me. I wanted to show you the Episcopal rest stop is the pub, the pub that we enjoyed, the Golden Lion. I had a Guinness for Marcus, our Irish friend. So this is just outside of the cathedral in Rochester, England, and there was this little alley right off of the sidewalk, and this sign was posted, and so I just snapped a picture. St. William's Gate in the Priory Wall, and through it pilgrims passed to the north transept door of the cathedral, and thence by the north choir aisle to the shrine of St. William of Perth. Pilgrimages were made to this shrine from the middle of the 13th century, so from the 1200s until the destruction of the shrine in 1538. When you stand in a place and you look at the stone on the ground and you see how worn it is from the 1,000 years or so, more than 1,000 years, of being trod upon, it's amazing. Less than 1,000 years. I was never a good math major, so. This is the cathedral in Rochester, England. It's a gorgeous cathedral. It was one of the first places that we stopped. Again, I'll point out that we have this detail here in this window that looks like the cross that we have here at Emmanuel. Site of the Saxon Cathedral, built by Ethelbert, King of Kent, AD 604. The line of the apse is marked inside the cathedral. Just to stop and to think that Christians have been worshiping in this space, on this hallowed ground, since 604, just sent chills up our spine. It was amazing to stand there and to join kind of the choir of Christians over the centuries in our prayer. That's just the outside of that cathedral. You can see, in fact, how old the statues are. This was not one of the statues that we'll see later, which was intentionally destroyed. This is just simply worn from years of being weathered. That's right outside the front door. This is the pamphlet that we got. So that picture that I just showed you of the statue was right outside the main entrance here. And then this is what's called the nave. This is where most of the folks gather for a Sunday service, for a Eucharistic service. There is an altar here. And then you go through this area into, this is the choir, where the choir stalls are, and I have a picture of that in just a moment. And then this would be the high altar back here. And I use the arrow to remind me that the nave, this main part right here, goes back to the 1100s. It's just amazing the amount of history that we were privileged to witness and see. This is the nave. So this area here can be seen here. This area right here is these statues here. That breaks up between the nave and the choir stalls. Isn't that beautiful? Yeah, it's really, really awesome. This is the choir stalls in this particular cathedral. Again, the picture doesn't do it justice in terms of the vertical height of these places. This is some of the floor tile that we had. And this is the same picture turned two different ways. So on this side of this picture, you can see a bird. You see the beak, and you see the wings, right? And it looks like it's perched on a branch of some kind. Well, when you look at it another way, it looks more like a gargoyle, which can be found and seen outside the church itself. I love those kind of images. That's kind of neat. I just wanted to show you, this is the high altar, so this is past the nave, past the choir at the cathedral in Rochester, and you can see just the exquisite artwork. Now, this would have post-dated. It would have come after the Reformation, because the Puritans went throughout England and they destroyed all kinds of statues and artwork and things like that. In fact, they uncovered this original artwork that was painted on the wall. A lot of that got covered up and destroyed during the Puritan revolts. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a bit. So we move on from Rochester, which was just a pit stop for an afternoon, and we move on to Canterbury Cathedral, the seat of Anglicanism. So Allison and I got to walk around town in the morning, and this was the first thing I saw early one morning in a butcher shop. And so I just had to take a picture of that. I thought he looked quite pleased. He's got a nice little smile. Again, this is just around Canterbury. The thing that was amazing about this is just how old so many of the buildings are. Like the old Weaver's House, which was a pub, established in AD 1500. I mean, to think that Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492 and that this goes back to 1500 is pretty impressive and awesome. No matter where you are in Canterbury, the cathedral seems to loom over the whole village and the whole town. They have a beautiful, beautiful cathedral shop. And then we went on, we didn't start at the cathedral, we actually went to what's called St. Martin's Chapel. That dates back to 580 AD. It's the oldest church in continuous use in the English-speaking world, 1400 years. Queen Bertha, of French descent, only agreed to marry King Ethelbert, who practiced a German Scandinavian paganism, if he agreed to allow her to maintain her Christian faith. He agreed and had this chapel built for her in 580 AD. In 597 AD, St. Augustine of Canterbury arrived in England after having been sent by Pope Gregory. Pope Gregory had seen in Rome blonde-haired, blue-eyed slaves, Anglos, and declared them angels. And his assistant said, not angels, but Anglos. So that's a name of a very popular book about Anglicans. Not angels, but Anglicans. Ethelbert agreed to meet with Augustine, recognized that Augustine was peaceful and not seeking to conquer him, and allowed Augustine to remain in England, and Ethelbert eventually converted to Christianity. It's important to know because Ethelbert was a very, he had a conquering spirit. He was somewhat vile and ruthless, if you will. And so for him to be open to receiving Augustine and eventually allowing Christianity to be set and convert to Christianity means a huge swing for the church in England. So this is St. Martin's Chapel, the one that goes back to 580 AD. Now this bell tower at the very front is not part of the original structure that goes back to 580 AD. Instead, the back part, which is back here, that goes back to 580 AD. Just a nice little, doesn't that look English? It just makes me want to have a cup of tea. And that's just the graveyard through that fence. We had a great time walking on that. So inside the chapel of St. Martin of Tours, we've got this section behind this wall here, behind this arch. This is the section that dates back to 580 AD that Queen Bertha had built. The baptismal font is relatively new. It was made in 1155, from 1155 to 1165. So not as antiquated as some of the other things that we saw. Then we moved on to Canterbury Cathedral. Though St. Augustine of Canterbury found St. Martin of Tours Chapel already in existence when he arrived in 597 AD, he founded Canterbury Cathedral and became England's first archbishop. The current cathedral was rebuilt by the Normans in 1070 following a fire. So the current cathedral is relatively new as well. On December 29th, 1170, Archbishop Thomas Becket was murdered in the cathedral by 4 knights who roguely responded to King Henry II's demand about Archbishop Becket, "Who will rid me of this troublesome priest?" Thomas Becket wasn't originally a priest. He was an opportunist, and he got close to the king and eventually won the honor of being named Archbishop of Canterbury. A lot of people objected. Archbishop Thomas Becket had a conversion of heart as Archbishop of Canterbury, and he became very pious and very holy. And in that piety and in that holiness, he began to butt heads with the king. The king doesn't like people to butt heads with him. And so that is why the king declared, "Who will rid me of this troublesome priest?" These knights who were in France at the time came over, hunted out Archbishop Becket, and they murdered him in the cathedral while the monks were praying evening prayer. It was quite gruesome. It was quite awful. And Thomas Becket's remains were interred in the cathedral and become the site of many pilgrims who claim miracles from visiting the site. Hence, a pilgrimage to Canterbury or of some sort. You have Geoffrey Chaucer, who wrote a poem about the pilgrimage to Canterbury. And so that's why Canterbury Cathedral drew so many pilgrims and so many people to it. Now in 1538, King Henry VIII has Becket's remains burned and destroyed, taking from the buried archbishop's hand a ruby ring from his dead finger 368 years after his murder. It's for these kinds of things that we in the Anglican Communion have not canonized King Henry VIII. That's just one of the reasons, many reasons why we haven't canonized him. We acknowledge Henry and his break with Rome, but we do not say that he was necessarily a saintly person while on earth. One of the neat things, and again, I couldn't bring my camera, we were given a private after-hours tour, which was filled with candlelight and prayer. So all the lights are off in the Canterbury Cathedral, and we have these little candles, and we got to go around and pray and be led by one of the canons of Canterbury Cathedral. Isn't that gorgeous? This is the entry gate in the middle of town, so you have to go through this entry gate and pass the people that collect the money in order to get it access to Canterbury Cathedral.
What did they charge you?
We didn't get charged because we were part of a tour group, so I don't know what it was, but I want to say it was like £7 or £8 maybe.
Which is?
Yeah, probably $10. I wanted to show you this. We actually stayed on the property of where Canterbury Cathedral is. There is a lodge of sorts, almost like a retreat center. So I snuck a picture of Allison having a cup of tea as we were looking at the cathedral from our room. So it's a really nice accommodation if you have the opportunity to stay there. This is the pulpit I ordered. That should be on its way. I don't think we have it in the budget. But this is, we're going up. But isn't that's just gorgeous. Again, I wish that the pictures did it justice in terms of the vertical height. And again, that ceiling is just gorgeous, the way it's arched and flowered. Remembering that a lot of these cathedrals, including Canterbury Cathedral, was first a monastery. And so this is what's known as the cloister. And so this is the archways and alleyways that the monks would use to go from their bedrooms over to the cathedral to pray. They would pray 7 times a day, as was the custom in the Roman Catholic Church. When England broke with Rome and we developed the Book of Common Prayer, we recognized that not everybody can live as monks. And expecting common people to live as monks and pray as monks is unreasonable. And so in the English church, we said, well, we still want to keep prayer built within the day, but we're going to focus on morning prayer, noonday prayer, evening prayer, and compline, which is bedtime or nighttime prayer. And so I think that's a more reasonable approach to prayer for common folk such as us. This is part of what's called the chapter house. Adjacent to the cathedral would have been the chapter house where all of the monks would gather on a daily basis to hear the rule of St. Benedict read for them. And it is another place where they would pray and have their meetings. They would elect their abbots. They would listen to readings and speeches and talks and things like that. Just some beautiful, beautiful scenery. Again, that shape keeps reappearing. This is all part of Canterbury Cathedral. This is kind of neat because this is just a side chapel. A little side chapel. Right? Just absolutely stunning. That's the side aisle up the nave. Again, you walk in and you just, I feel bad because all of my pictures are vertical like this, but it's because I wanted to try to get so much of the vertical height in the frame. And that's the main part of the church, the nave. This is the choir, of course, where the choir boys would sit and sing for morning or for evening prayer, an even song. This is the high altar here. Again, we're in Canterbury Cathedral at this point. Now, this is the cathedral that was founded by Augustine of Canterbury. They call this Augustine's chair. A question was asked, did Augustine actually sit in that chair? And the answer from the tour guide was, oh dear, no. Augustine was here in 597 AD. This chair is a new chair which comes from about the 1100s. So that's the new chair. This candle is burning in the spot where Thomas Becket's body was lying in state, where the pilgrims would come and pray, where it was taken up by King Henry VIII and destroyed. That candle represents the place where that took place in the 1500s. So this is outside of Canterbury Cathedral. Again, the statues would have been put there and replaced the statues that were destroyed during the Puritan revolt. Just absolutely gorgeous. Again, more. I love the cloisters. I could have just lived out there and prayed out there. Just so beautiful to me. So we leave Canterbury. We get on the bus and we're headed to Norwich. So you can understand, this is Canterbury. Here's London. We bypass London. We stop for one night in a place called Long Melford, and then we go on to Norwich. I'll show you a bit about Holy Trinity Church in Long Melford, which was completed in 1484. Records indicate that a church was on this site since before 1198. The stained glass and the statues were destroyed by Puritans. Long Melford was a town that was very wealthy due to the wool trade, and actually Long Melford was a seat of Puritanism, and a lot of Puritans that came to the United States or came to America came from Long Melford. It remains a parish church and is in use today. I just love the English. Polite notice, no parking. Polite notice. And you can see where we parked. So this is the church, Holy Trinity Church at Long Melford. It's a gorgeous church. This one I hijacked. It was a cloudy day that day, very overcast. So I hijacked this one from the internet. I'm gonna admit any picture that I borrow from the internet along the way. And I think those were only two, just the first one and this one. You can see where statues were. They had statues all in here. The Puritans got a hold of them and destroyed the statues because they felt that the church in England was still too Catholic and they wanted to really embrace Protestantism, and so they felt that statues was worship of idols. They felt that stained glass windows were not appropriate, and so all those got destroyed as well. That's the little choir stall. I took this picture because I wanted to show the Fiber Guild and Joanne Gaffney and the crew that kind of like the cushions that we have here, the needlepoint cushions. Is it needlepoint? Or is it? Yeah, that's needlepoint. All the churches seem to have this kind of needlepoint everywhere we went. And again, kind of like that little cross, that round cross that we use, kind of made me feel like, well, gee whiz, Emmanuel's very connected to our Anglican roots and heritage. That's the other pulpit I ordered. This comes from Mary's Chapel, which was adjacent to the main body of the church. It was a separate chapel. But can you see the name Mary in this symbol? You have the M, right? Then there's the A, then there's the R, and then there's the Y. You see that? One of the things I wanted to point out in that is that everywhere that we went, there were statues, there were stained glass windows, and there were deep devotions to Mary. Oftentimes we think that in our Anglican heritage that we disavowed the appreciation of Mary, but really in true Anglican circles, Mary is still revered. Not worshipped, but revered and held in high esteem. We left Long Melford and went on to Norwich. And the first place we stopped was the Lady Julian Shrine in Norwich. Let me give you some historical background. I am stealing these explanations from our tour guide, Dr. Les Fairfield. He talked about, in the Middle Ages, the piety of fear. The piety of fear that was pushed in the church, in the Catholic Church, at the time the only church. And there's a lot of reasons for that. So Europe has these long summers, this long summer from late 900s to late 1200s. It wasn't as cold, it had kind of gone through maybe some global warming type experience. Food supplies increase, crop rotations are introduced so that you don't exhaust the fields, and the population explosion all lead to towns, trades, architecture, universities, etc. Think about it, 900 to 1200 is a long time. Now Europe goes through a cold spell through the late 1600s, and that cuts short the growing seasons. Between 1315 and 1317, he said we had what was called the wet summers. And that causes the crops to drown. Poor people eat seeds to survive, leaving nothing to plant for the next year. Various animal diseases kill millions of sheep and cattle, leaving little meat to eat. And rye seed grain rot in barns, leading to ergotism, hallucinations and spasms, in both animals and then humans. Then the Black Death comes along several years later, between 1347 and 1351. That was born and spread by fleas on rats, on ships, killing 30% of Europe's population. They think that the fleas on the rats on the ships actually originated somewhere in Asia, and as trade routes opened up and people started to travel more, that's how it spread throughout Europe, killing 30% of the population. So you have this English Franciscan friar, William of Ockham, and he preaches that life is bad. Nothing makes sense or fits together. Reality is like the Superdome with God outside and humans are stuck on earth inside. The church, he preaches, is the caretaker of the ladder that leads from misery and suffering inside the dome to escape through a hatch outside the dome and into heaven. The cost of entry onto this ladder is penance, good works, sacraments, building churches, chapels, endowing chantries, etc. It was a very depressing time and an expensive time. Julian of Norwich comes along, and she preaches what is dubbed the piety of love. She contradicted the piety of fear. In 1373, at the age of 30, she was near death and saw visions, something she calls showings. She became what's called an anchorite at St. Julian's Church, which is how she then adopted the name Julian of Norwich. We don't know what her real name is. An anchorite is a person who they have a cell built for themselves right off of the sanctuary of the church. They go into that room, they get sealed into that room, and there's one small window, one small hole between their cell and where the church is. And they pray for their entire lives. They have a servant that is assigned to them, or several servants in some cases, who pass them food, take their waste buckets out. And when I say waste buckets, I mean all waste that a human being might produce has to come out of there. And they spend time for the rest of their lives praying there. This Julian of Norwich spent 40 years, and her focus of her prayer and her contemplation were the visions that she received during her near-death experience at age 30 and trying to understand them. And she wrote about them. She wrote that sin is befitting, but all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. Our soul is made to be God's dwelling place. So you can see already how her vision of the piety of love contradicts the piety of fear. She taught that God, to be total love and angry, means that he would be at war within himself. And she also wrote of a very earth-shattering thing at the time about the femininity of the Trinity. Actually, Mother Elizabeth Bryan in the fall plans on doing a presentation on this idea, this notion. So, here we are in Julian of Norwich's church. This is a baptismal font. Look how beautiful it is. This is her cell. I could not get a really good picture of inside the cell because it was so small and it was always crowded with our pilgrims. But inside her cell, there's a place to pray. Here dwelt Mother Julian, Anchoress of Norwich, from 1342 to 1430. And she would always say, "Thou art enough to me." This is the outside of her cell. You can see how it's attached to the church body itself. Now, this church was heavily damaged during World War II because the Germans came and bombed the church. The walls fell in, but the people of Norwich recognized it as such a holy and important shrine that they immediately rebuilt it right away. That's just a gate going into the garden. So we moved from Julian Shrine over to the Norwich Cathedral. And here's a little bit about the Norwich Cathedral. The first foundation stone was laid in 1096. It was built in the Romanesque style, which was widespread from the 10th through the 12th centuries, known in England as the Norman style. And the cathedral was completed in 1140. So to complete this, to start in 1096 and complete it in 1140 is quite an incredible feat. Now, Allison and I got to attend the Sunday Eucharist there, and we were asked to bring up the gifts, which was just this awesome privilege to do that. Later that Sunday, we attended an Epiphany procession with carols by the boys' choir through the church. And the ancient Epiphany celebrations included not only the visit of the Magi, but also the baptism of Jesus and the first miracle at Cana. There is, just like with Canterbury Cathedral, there's an exterior gate that you walk through to get to the cathedral. And then that's the cathedral itself, the cathedral in Norwich. That's a modern depiction of Julian of Norwich, and that's the inside. There was a mirror so that you could see the ceiling, and I told Allison, I said, you know, people, when I do the presentation, people are going to say, where were you? You weren't in any of the pictures, so I snapped that up. That I actually took with my phone. And I just love the arches and the ceilings. We were there at such a beautiful part of the day. You can see some of the reflection or the colors of the stained glass window bleeding onto the stonework. This is their baptismal font, which is not very old. It's probably only 5 or 10 years old. There was a chocolate factory in Norwich. The chocolate factory closed, donated this thing to the church, and they made it their baptismal font, which, I'll be honest, made me a little sad. Anytime a chocolate factory closes, I'm very sad. But it was just an odd juxtaposition between modernity and antiquity. You can actually see me taking the picture and Allison standing next to me in the reflection.
What did that organ sound like?
That organ was incredible. It'll blow your hair back. It'll blow your hair back. I took that picture for Joanne to see, so I hope she gets to see this. Again, vertical height, bringing the soul upwards. And this is the third pulpit I ordered. This is just a side chapel. And again, I like to point out that artwork and icons and things of that nature don't necessarily flow against our Anglican heritage or Anglican roots. You see the cross, the round cross way up at the top? I had to put the arrow there so I wouldn't remember why I put that blurry picture in there. But isn't that gorgeous? Now, I wanted to show this because in a lot of the cathedrals and a lot of the places where we were, there were pictures that were painted, and they painted them using wardrobe, and you can see it in this guy here, wardrobe of the time that the painting was done. And what this reminded me of, and you can see this is not how somebody at Jesus' crucifixion would have been dressed, but somebody of the time period that the painting was done. And what it reminded me of was the awesome Christmas presentation that the youth group did, and taking the ancient story and modernizing it so that people can relate to it and understand it in a different context. It wasn't done to devalue the original story, but it's done so that people can have a sense of connectivity to the story in a different way. They had a cloister here, so obviously there was monks who were in Norwich Cathedral at one time before those were dissolved by Henry VIII. So, moving on to King's Lynn. I was most excited about this day because King's Lynn is where my ancestors hail from. So here's King's Lynn, here's London. We had been to Canterbury, we went to Norwich, and we just took a day trip, which is about an hour and 19-minute bus ride to King's Lynn. That I just snapped from the bus. What was neat was, as we drive for an hour or so through the countryside, we kept passing all these churches. And so I just snapped them from the window. I mean, all these churches are, these little country churches, they're all historical, they're all old, they all have stories to tell. We only have so much time. This is All Saints Church in King's Lynn, again, where my family hails from. That's the baptismal font. Anybody recognize this bell? It looks just like the one we have. Oh, and we bumped into a well-known couple while we were there. Actually, we were in the mayor's office, and I got my picture taken with the mayor, and this is his garb. And in that office was a picture of the Queen and Prince Philip, and I just snapped a picture of the picture. So. Now, this is the church where my ancestors were baptized, married, and buried. This is St. Margaret's Church in King's Lynn. And Allison will tell you, I was like a nervous cat. I was so excited that day.
Oh, selfish.
That was the one day that I chose to wear my collar. I don't know, I thought maybe it would help me somehow in getting information that I wanted. This is the baptismal font that my ancestors in the 1700s, before coming to America, this is the baptismal font where my ancestors would have been baptized. And there I am, blessing myself with the water that's in there. It's amazing to have some kind of personal connection to a church like that. This is their altar. I ordered this for our altar to go behind our altar. Isn't that nice? Yep. This is their choir stalls. That's their pulpit. And again, that's the outside. That's part of our tour group. I didn't take very many pictures of these folks, but don't they look like they have the flu? Then we went to the Crown and Mitre. I have another picture of the sign, and this bar and restaurant goes back to 1742. I'm not sure it's under the same management, but it goes way back. That's just a beautiful picture of my wife. So then we get into Cambridge. We leave Norwich, we leave King's Lynn, and we go on to Cambridge. Cambridge University is a conglomeration of multiple colleges, including Trinity College, King's College, and Emmanuel College. Now there's about 20 of them, so that's just a small sample. We bought some, sweatshirts and stuff for our girls. We're trying to push them in the direction of Cambridge. Cambridge, just to orient yourself, here is Norwich. King's Lynn was up here behind this. And here's Cambridge, here's London. So we're getting back towards London. They have a river that flows through Cambridge, and they just have beautiful scenery there.
Did you go punting?
Did not go punting. We didn't have time. I would love to go punting. This is a new little shop that came around in 1689, and I'm like, golly, can you imagine having a clothing store open for that long? Oh, and I like the fact that up here it says robe makers. Those little telephone booths. This is King's College Chapel. I'll show you more about that in just a moment. So we went to a church. There are churches and chapels everywhere. Each college at Cambridge has its own designated chapel. And so the chapels aren't just for the public to come in and use. They're welcome to come and participate, but the chapels really are for the faculty and the students of each college. So there are chapels everywhere. Now in Cambridge, there is the St. Edward Church. A parish church has stood here for about 1,000 years. St. Edward's was the cradle of the English Reformation. So, how are we doing on time? I'm going to kind of buzz through this a little bit. So, I'm going to skip all that. How about this? On the Sunday before Christmas in 1525, Robert Barnes preached a sermon rooted in Reformation theology. It lit a spark in England. This is the church where he had given that sermon. A plaque acknowledging Thomas Bilney, Robert Barnes, and Hugh Latimer. They were the ones who really introduced Reformation theology in England. And this is the pulpit, the actual pulpit that he used to preach that really, the reforming minded sermon. It was kind of funny, we all had the same complaint. There's a modern jam box pushed under there for their music. It's like, really? This thing goes back to the 1500s and you got a 1983 music box underneath? The baptismal font. Now this church, just to remind myself, this church, the nave goes back to about 1400. We ran into the Cambridge University Press bookshop, which I took every ounce of strength I had not to buy everything in their religion section. But this is Cambridge. This is where the colleges are. This is Cambridge University. You see bikes everywhere for the students. A lot of young people. This is Trinity College's chapel. Not as popular or famous, but just as beautiful, maybe even more beautiful than King's College Chapel, which we eventually got to. And this is where we're going to come now. So we're at King's College Chapel. Just by way of making the connection, you know that at Christmas time, we, Emmanuel Parish, sponsors the 9 lessons and carols from King's College. It's broadcast live on NPR, and we sponsor that. We did it 2 years, so now it's a tradition, and we have to for the rest of our existence. But this is where it originates from. I just thought that was neat, the way they built the gutter to be seamless around the curvature of the brickwork. So this is, of course, inside. As we go through the pictures of inside King's College Chapel, and this, Allison and I agree, really was one of our favorite spots, you'll see the color from the stained glass that gets projected from one wall to the other. Isn't that gorgeous? That's the top of the organ against the ceiling. How awesome. You can see where they had an alcove here that had statues. So a lot of the statues during the Puritan Revolt were taken out of here too. I just wanted to show that even the king is a Saints fan. You got the crown above the fleur-de-lis. And here's the choir stalls. So all these churches are set up much in the same way, where you have the nave on the other side of this rood screen. Then you come through the screen and you've got the choir, and then beyond the choir is the main or high altar. Beautiful woodwork, beautiful intricate detail on the stonework. It's just unbelievable. Again, in the stained glass windows in King's College, you can see what would have been the modern dress of the people in the stained glass window. Again, it was very common back then for people to modernize art in stained glass windows to give people a sense of connection to the story of Jesus. Now, we stayed in Cambridge, but we took a day trip to the town of Ely and went to Ely Cathedral, which is this cathedral here. I was really drawn to this cathedral for some reason. I really loved it. There were elements of modern in it, including, this is the baptismal font, and on a far wall, you can't even imagine how far away this wall is, this image of the cross, and it almost looked like it was pouring the water directly into the font. It was just really cool. This is the door that the monks would have entered through to come in and pray 7 times a day. They had this, what did they call it, Allison? I forget what this was referenced as. But it actually caved in the 1100s, right after the monks had been in there praying. And so they kind of they shored it up, they fixed it, and it was quite an architectural and engineering marvel that they were able to fix it and get it propped back up there. Again, I can't begin to tell you how high this is. And you can see on the ceiling there are things that are painted, right? So that actually comes from, I think, the Victorian era. That's not something that would have been original to the building, but during the Victorian period, they dressed it up and made it more beautiful in that regard. That's just awesome. Yeah. Oh, I wish you all could come with us. That's just beautiful to me. The sense of awe and wonder, the sense of God's enormity, but the closeness, all comes down in these huge cathedrals. The sacred are very present. I was very impressed too because people would get on a loudspeaker once every 30 minutes or so, and they would say, welcome pilgrims, welcome visitors. Although this is a tourist destination, this is still a place of prayer. So would you please stop taking pictures, pause for a moment, and let us pray. And they would lead us in prayer. It was awesome. I'd love to have some altar dressing. Isn't that neat? It's old. Old. So this is from the choir stall looking back towards the nave with the painted ceiling up top. And I know I'm kind of rushing through this, but we're almost done actually. This is some graffiti that they had in a side chapel. 1628 was the graffiti's date. And that's the ceiling from the Victorian period. That's a detail of the ceiling. And you can see it. They had several panels that gave scripture stories. This particular cathedral in Ely was founded by Etheldreda. Etheldreda, who founded this community in 673. Etheldreda was a Christian, and there were several people who wanted to marry her, and she did not want to get married. She wanted to be a monastic. She wanted to be a nun. She got married, didn't consummate the marriage, was allowed out of the marriage by her husband, and then she became a monastic. But she was a saint and a queen and founded this community. Now, in their chapter house, if you remember, I talked about the chapter house over at Canterbury, I think it was, I talked about it. The chapter house here, where the monks would have met and read the Rule of St. Benedict, they actually have turned it into a side chapel, and this depiction of Mary was created in the year 2000 for the Millennium Celebration. For those of you who have been to New Orleans and seen Mardi Gras floats, that's what it puts me in the mind of. Not my favorite picture of depiction of Mary. I also called it Touchdown Mary. And obviously she's a Seahawks fan based on her blue, so we know who will win. What's really neat about this, and you can see this is where the monks would have sat and prayed and visited and had meetings. What's interesting is there are these little statues all over the place, and they're all headless except for one. There was one statue that the Puritans really were nervous about decapitating. That would have been John the Baptist. He was able to keep his head at long last. But all throughout the room, these large areas where these huge statues would have been, and they were all destroyed by those Puritans. And just to give you perspective, so you've got this, which looks rather large in and of itself, but you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, and the whole room is surrounded by these empty alcoves. Then we came home. I had the flu bug. We moved, and we had our annual meeting. And it's been joy ever since. So that's our trip. That's Epiphany in England. And I strongly encourage anyone, if you ever get a chance to take this trip or any trip, the group we used was Connoisseur Tours. And they did a fantastic job. So thank you for coming and listening and watching my little picture show. Yes.
When do you plan to start construction?
Soon. As soon as the funds.
You got to raise the roof.
I was going to say as soon as the funds loosen up.
I'm gonna figure it out. It's managed by everybody.